Welcome to the Level Up Artist Podcast. We're your hosts, Adriana M.A. and
Jackie Sanders. We are two art professionals sharing forward the advice and business lessons we have learned along our creative journeys.
We talk to artists, leaders, and art professionals to demystify the creative process and discover new ways to succeed as a career-minded artist.
If you find value in these conversations, please go ahead and subscribe. This will help other creatives like you find our podcast, and you'll be notified when we launch a new episode every Tuesday.
So on today's episode, we don't have one, we have two special guests. Yay! So we have Amanda and Shaun with us, and we'll dive a little bit deeper into, some of their backgrounds and how they got started. But I'll just preface it by this: one is a curator and one is an artist. So this is going to be fun. I'm going to start with you, Amanda, and just do a brief introduction, and then Jackie will do the rest. So we'll go from there. So Amanda Maples is a curator of African art for the North Carolina Museum of Art. Previously, she was a curatorial fellow in African and Indigenous American art at Stanford University. She has co-authored various publications and has worked with many prestigious institutions, including the Smithsonian and Yale University. Amanda received her PhD in visual studies from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and her research focus is on African and diaspora arts and the politics of museum display. Welcome to the podcast, Amanda.
Thank you.
And next to her, for those watching on YouTube, is Shaun. So Shaun is an artist based in Raleigh, North Carolina, who focuses on paintings, mixed media, and assemblage. Originally from Georgia, he has traveled extensively and has been included in numerous exhibitions throughout the Southeast, including the North Carolina Museum of Art, the Green Hill Center, and Cam Raleigh. Shaun's work focuses on figurative work and contrasting applications of paint, the use of narrative, and investigates the use of signifiers that is integral to his work. Conceptually, he is centered on human incentives, artifice, and the dissection of classifications and assumptions, why we do what we do, and how it is reflected within society. So thank you guys both for being here. We're so excited to have you on the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. We're delighted. So in terms of how we all got to meet you guys, I want to say, Amanda, I met you at one of the early openings of the NCMA and their new collection. And there were curators everywhere. And I was very lucky that one of the staff members was like, this is a great day to come in. It's not all ready yet, but there's no throngs of people crowding the place. And there's curators everywhere, and you can just talk to them about the collections they're curating. So I made my rounds, and you were one of the first ones. And I remember I was like, ooh, I love that dress. You were wearing like this cutout dress. It was really cool. And then we got started. Yeah, that one. And then we got started talking about like the African collection, diaspora, Yoruba culture, and mass. And anyways, we went down quite the rabbit hole. And then interestingly enough, Shaun had just moved into art space, but I also spotted Shaun at the NCMA working and helping out with the installations too. So it was like, oh, hey. So regardless, Shaun would have met you anyway. So that worked out. But you're my next door neighbor at art space right now. So yeah, I think that's the long story short of how we all met.
I met you on a Sunday, then I saw you on Monday talking to her.
Yeah, pretty much.
The small art world in any city, you kind of cross paths. You're like, wait, I recognize that face.
Especially Smalley. It's not like we have the biggest art scene here. So
Oh, I love that. Smalley.
And another thing to note, the reason we're here together today is that we're married.
Oh, yes. Let's put that in our
That's not just random.
Just hanging out together.
Yeah, just two artists,
And we'll definitely be diving into that connection and how you guys met and all that. But real quick, Shaun, having a studio down the hall or next to Adriana and down the hall from me, I've loved being able to see your creative space grow and change as you've had a studio there. But how would you describe your work to someone who's never seen it before?
It's usually figurative, narrative, and with some social commentary. I like different applications of paint, so doing things that either have realism and abstraction, some combination of flat or graphic. Hence I use stencils sometimes. use mixed media where I use a collage and then paint over the collage. And mentioning signifiers in my artist statement was more about how things can become emblematic through pop culture, through history, through reappropriation.
All the different ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I like one of the pieces you had on display recently to give folks, that maybe they're in their car. Otherwise, obviously, we'll have links to everything. Is you had a piece on display near the entrance of Art Space recently that looked as though it had newspaper in the background, although I don't think it was newspaper. But then it had, what would you call those metal poles? And then there were people on the poles.
Jungle gyms.
Jungle gym, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So like it caught your eye at first because it wasn't just a realistic, like photorealistic image, although the persons themselves looked realistic, but it made you stop. Why is the background completely different as opposed to a landscape or something else you might expect? So, I mean, that'll give folks a rough idea if you think that's accurate.
Oh, yeah, that's accurate. It was
Tell them what that is. Yeah.
they were pages from a gun catalog.
A vintage one. What is it from the?
It's from the 80s. Not
80s?
that vintage, yeah.
Well, that's vintage now, unfortunately. That's like
It doesn't sound vintage to people our age.
I know.
I
I
know.
love that.
That has a 19 before it, so it's vintage now.
Yes, it is.
But yeah, he kind of created his own canvas from the pages of those catalogs. And there's a piece, I don't know if you shared the link to it or not, but it's a young boy that was taken from that catalog, and Shaun painted him though, and he's sort of pointing the gun, and he strategically placed them really well with some of the guns in the catalog kind of pointing at one another. It's really a beautiful moment. One of my favorite moments in that series that you've done. Sorry, my curator brain is stuck.
I know. I feel like that's probably why you guys are such a good pair. And I can only imagine the types of conversations that you have on a regular basis between the artist's mind and then crafting the narrative as a curator, and both just being in that space all day, every day with very different vantage points, but also very much in line. I think that's so cool.
I know.
We have
And
different
then
tastes sometimes though.
yeah. I'm sure it has its pros and cons, like everything, but relationships, as we all know, are compromised. So there's that. Artist or not. Amanda, quick question for you before we, dive deeper into the conversation. Again, trying to give folks kind of like an introduction here. How would you describe your role as a curator?
I've actually spent a lot of time talking about this, and I've even given lectures recently at UNC about the curatorial process, and we find ourselves at a really interesting turning point in curatorial praxis and in museum experience, in that curators are being asked to wear many more hats than we originally used to wear. And this idea of the curator as expert or a singular knowledge keeper is just not kosher anymore. It's not accurate, and it's not the way that we have really plural conversations and highlight multiple narratives and spaces. So I consider myself a conduit more than anything else, a person that has this privilege of bringing in other voices. And I mean privilege is not a born into privilege, it's just like a pleasure privilege kind of thing. Like I'm lucky that it's my job where I get to talk about art. I get to think about it all the time. I get to try to make connections to highlight relevance today. So I had to think about what's happening in the United States or right here in North Carolina. How can artists and art highlight those experiences or reveal those experiences to us? So that's a big part of my job, is trying to connect what the artist might be saying, and sometimes you don't know, to some of the things we're experiencing here in the US or in North Carolina or even globally. And again, offering opportunities for other voices to come in. So I really just think of myself as this sort of cog in a much larger sort of system, if that makes sense. So yeah. I think does that get there? Yeah, I get to think about art. I get to write about it all the time. I put together exhibitions. I write books. I write catalogs. I write blog posts. A lot of writing, a lot of reading and writing and talking to artists is what I do. So
much writing.
So much.
So much writing.
And not always the fun writing. I'm writing a grant right now, and that's, sort of interesting, but not, it's not the fun, heady stuff. But at the same time, that is such a labor of intense energy that
Yeah.
it takes a lot of your power.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
feel like all of those projects are such different writing styles that are needed. Like you were saying, both in like the depth of how far you can go into it, but also the lens in which you're looking. Like a blog post is very different than writing, obviously, a grant proposal, which is very different than writing a book of long form. And so I'm sure that's also a skill that you've had to hone over the years too, of not just having an idea, having a voice, crafting that narrative, but also then almost in a digital content standpoint, repurposing it for all these different avenues in which you use it to express yourself, also connect with other people, and bring people into the art world wherever they're finding you, whether a blog, a book, through a program.
Yeah, and if I were to say it in a much shorter form, I would say that curatorial work is a process of distillation
Oh,
Ooh.
yeah.
and connectivity. So
Ooh.
seeing the bigger picture, seeing the matrix, and then making connections, and then distilling it down into identifiable themes that people can kind of connect to. It's like that's where the
Yeah.
connectivity part comes from.
Which that's not that different from what artists are doing as well. It's like we're, taking our experiences or the things happening around us and translating it through the canvas, hoping somebody else can connect to it as well. And also distilling, because we're not going to show everything through a canvas. We'd never stop painting. It'd be like 24/7 till we die. We need to sleep and eat too, but I like how those two connect, and also how it also helps off like out the gate demystify the fact that it's not what some people may think of you going, show me all the art pieces. No, no, no. Next, next, next. There's actually a lot of administrative tasks and a lot of writing and things that go behind it. It's not the hoity-toity thing of the past of like, not good enough. It's a little more complicated than
I
that.
scan and copy and write letters and update the database and all sorts of real not fun stuff. Just saying.
That's okay. Hey, we got to do the same thing too. So
I would
updating
say
websites and doing sales and
yeah, you're doing everything as an artist, right? Which sort of makes sense, especially in a smaller regional museum like the NCMA.
a lot of hats.
Yeah, I would say the big difference though between an artist is that I think you get to focus much more on your personal experience, where I'm supposed to sort of disengage my personal ideas about things to some extent. It's not about me; it's about our community. It's about people being seen and heard in a space. So it's a really interesting and tricky position to be in. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And so going off of that, I'm curious, when did you like first get started with curating art? Like, did you have a specific memory growing up or a specific experience that really drew your connection to the art world and knowing that that was a path you wanted to take?
Yeah, I'd say the first time that art really blew my mind, I grew up in rural North Carolina. I grew up out in Havelock, North Carolina, if you know where that is. I didn't have art, or I didn't know what anthropology was, for example, which is actually the area I came through originally. But the first time I really experienced art was when I went to Spain. I was 16 years old. Everyone was going to Cancun to party. I saved all my money to go to France and Spain to go see all the castles and the museums. I wanted to nerd, basically. Like capital N nerd. And that's when I saw Goya's paintings for the first time in Spain. And we're actually going to be going to the same space again in January. It's the Prado, right? Yeah. In any case, Goya kind of blew my mind. And then I suppose growing up, we didn't do a whole lot of going to museums because there weren't any where I grew up. And so I think my mom would make special trips to take us to the Smithsonian's. And so that was also a big part of me loving museums from an early age. And then the biggest turning point was when I did my master's degree in the UK. And I started working for the British Museum at the Royal Anthropological Institute and researching their video collection and their photography. And so just kind of being able to get into behind the scenes and into the collections and dusty boxes and unpacking them and finding the connections and discovering new things and then putting that out to the world for people to engage with was, yeah, I was like, okay, museums are for me. That was in 2003 or 4, and I haven't turned back since. So I'd say that's when it happened for me. If you have a similar question for Shaun, because he was at it for a long time too. I mean, he knew pretty early on.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah. So Shaun, tell us a little bit more about that. Were you that kid that was always drawing growing up? Did you always like
Pretty
want to do
much
art as a
that.
kid?
I didn't have any eureka or, I drew a lot when it came time to think about, um, careers or choosing a major or schools and all that. Like I just kind of always knew I was going to follow art. So I had a very fortunate sort of like always know what I wanted to do. Um, and then the more art history I got to know in college and grad school, the more into it I got. Um,
Were you always doing figurative work? Like from the get-go, like more realistic stuff, or ever dive into
yeah,
full
I mean,
abstraction art?
a bit, but I don't get the same satisfaction from abstraction in terms of when I make things. This is me. Some of my favorite painters are abstract painters, but it's just like I'm really analytical in what I'm doing, and so it doesn't I like the
Doesn't
messaging
scratch the
and
same
being able to
itch.
yeah.
That makes total sense. And I am curious. I feel like it's a common conversation with artists, especially having community facing studios. And I'm sure at the art museum as well, talking to visitors. You always talk to artists of all ages, whether they're in middle school, high school, graduates, maybe they're finding the arts later in their life in their 60s, 70s. I feel like a lot of the time we hear a common narrative of when taking the more formal track of education with the arts of you kind of get two narratives. Either parents are super, super supportive in that and are celebrating the arts. They grew up going to museums and was always ingrained in the arts, or the narrative of wanting the best for their kids, thinking that it might not be a practical field to go to. So I'm curious what both of your guys' experience were with that of maybe what your parents do professionally, or if that was an impact on your journey one way or the other.
Want me to go first?
Yeah.
So I will say that my mom is my biggest fan. She always has been. And so she was definitely instrumental in being a strong, stubborn woman and fighting for what you want and what you believe in. At the same time, when I chose anthropology, I was doing archaeology and anthropology when I first graduated in high school, and she was terrified for me. She was like, "You should do something that's going to make you money. You're never going to get a job in anthropology." And then I gravitated towards visual anthropology, and she was still just like, "Are you nuts? You're never going to get a job." And then I think she saw me just still continue and start getting work in museums, even as I was getting my degrees. And she was like, "Okay, I get it now."
Yeah.
She's always been all my piano recitals, everything I've ever done. She's always been there and always been my biggest supporter. So I'd say even though she at first forbid me to study anthropology, I think she legitimately wanted me to do well in life, and she was like, "Psychology, architecture, something else."
Yeah.
I completely relate with this.
Yeah, she knows that I know my mind, and that's her fault because she's the same person, know your mind, go your way. And so I think she was kind of like, "All right, we'll see how it goes." And it went well. So that was the kind of support that I got. And my dad still doesn't really understand what I do. Bless him. He's a nice enough person, loves me, but he still is like, "You're still going to Africa, honey? Isn't that dangerous?" I'm like, "Oh, there's so many problems with that."
Yeah.
Downtown anywhere can be dangerous.
Exactly. Yeah. So I don't think he has a true handle on what curatorial work is, but I know he's proud of me. He's proud in the sort of broad ethereal way where he doesn't quite get what I do, but it must be pretty cool because I'm doing okay.
Yeah.
I have a degree.
That's one of my favorite questions to ask parents is like, okay, like what do I do for work? Like my friends or my friends' parents, and they never can explain it, right? And you're like, that's close enough. It's fine.
Yeah. Yeah, well, my dad was a Marine, and my dad that also raised me very much. My stepdad, who I consider my dad, really, I adore him. They're both retired Marines, and my mom worked for the government. She worked in contracts and all sorts of things that don't have anything to do with what I do. And I will say I'm the first and only PhD in the family. And my sister and I were the first undergraduate degrees in the entire extended family as well. So we're first generation hardcore in that sense. So I'm definitely, that's part of the reason my dad's just like, what do you do? Why do you need a PhD for it? Yeah, that's my sort of long answer about what my parents do or don't get about my life. What about you? You had support.
Sure. I wasn't told no, and I wasn't, I don't know, they weren't unsupportive, but there wasn't like this celebration of it or anything. And
there weren't artists in the family, right?
No, and they still don't really understand what I'm doing. So
at least we have that in common.
Yeah, I mean, it has so much to do with education, and that's just not where they're focused. My dad was a chemical engineer. My mom was a teacher, but she didn't have a degree. It was for this. We went to this culty church school that she taught that.
So, I love that for you. Love that.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, there wasn't. I was never unsupported, but there certainly wasn't a interest in what I chose to do.
Fair enough. But they did buy you, like, if you said, I need new pencils, I need, acrylic paints. Like, it's not like they were like, no. They were like, okay, sure.
Yeah, I don't know. I was as much engaged in sports in high school as I was in that sort of stuff. But I was an emo kid, so like I was also into sad music. But anyway.
You just
sad boy with an eye.
Yeah. He likes the sad boy music.
Hey, you were just like building that base for all these artistic concepts that will be explored the rest of your life. Everyone needs that.
But with all that, yeah, there's a lot in here that I'm like, oh, I relate to that too. Because Amanda, on your end, it's like I was thinking when I was in the 6th grade, I basically declared in my household that I was going to be an Egyptologist. That went well. I was like, I love ancient Egypt, and I'm going to go and like dig up some tombs, and the next Tut, King Tut, here it is. Obviously, it didn't go that way. And then also, Shaun, the part that you said of like they were like okay with it, same thing on my end. I want to say they were a little more like, can you do business instead, kind of thing, and then art too.
I got encouraged to do the grad school thing to get a master's so that I could teach. And then about the time I got into that pipeline, it just seemed like a big scam to me. Like, it does qualify you, but no one's hiring. It's not the same track it once was in terms of being supported and given a studio and a reasonable workload. And now all the adjuncts, everyone's got a master's and teaches adjunct, and no one does it full time.
Yeah.
So I just sort of saw that happening, and then I saw a lecture by a guy named Dave Hickey who was just like, "Don't go to grad school." It's
yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Not a scam, but it's more about the institutions making money than it is for you. And do I want to go another $60,000, $100,000 in debt for?
Well, and it depends if you have the money, the time and the money. So there's that too. Yeah.
Yeah. So when I was a freshman at Virginia Tech, one of my first semester professors, who then grew to be one of my mentors, he does amazing laser cut paper sculptures and exhibits them all over the world. I remember one distinct lecture that he gave just about the art and having your voice be heard through your work, what you need to say, all these conceptual things you discuss in art school. But him even sharing, like, true to their core artists don't need art school to be successful. Like, you're just making because you can't do anything else but make. And we're like, well, we're all paying like X thousands of dollars to be here, and we're 18, and it was an interesting conversation, but that always stuck with me, especially now, of course, after graduating and pursuing your professional career as an artist. You really realize, removed from academia, it is a very suitable path for a lot of people, but it's not this like direct path that everyone might have the perspective of when you're 17, 18. Like, I have to go to art school. And you're like, you can also just be an artist and take workshops and refine your craft and find your voice that way.
It's different than if you want to grow up to be an accountant, You do go to business school, you get an accounting degree, you intern in an accounting firm. Like that's way more linear. But art, like whether it's the curatorial route like you went, Amanda, or a visual artist like Shaun and the rest of us, it's like, yeah, you don't necessarily need a degree for that. I mean, it's helpful, but
Mm.
but
Yeah.
with that, speaking of schools and kind of backgrounds and whatnot, Shaun, I'd like to ask you, and you kind of answered some of this earlier, but why the focus on figurative work? Like, why? Like, do you know why that calls to you besides like the narrative?
Just basically, it doesn't feel like a choice. It's just sort of what I do. Um, I have sort of lamented not being more, uh, you know, how to say it, more abstract.
Abstract, yeah.
But in terms of digestibility and collectability, I think that's an easier road than being political. So
Yeah.
I lament that in some ways, just not, yeah.
Yeah, and I think with the concerns that you have, the thoughtfulness behind your work, it becomes more legible and manifests itself in those figurative and more direct kind of objects in your painting. So like the car crash series or the Veil series, or he's thinking so much about American politics and our day-to-day experiences and how things have dramatically changed over the last few years, which of course I touched on a little in terms of curatorial and museum work. It's changed the landscape of things. Absolutely, it's changed the landscape of being an artist. And identity politics are so important now in all the work that we do in the art field in a general sense. And so I think you are thinking about those things all the time, and that manifests itself in that figurative and in that object-based work. It's just legible for you and what you're thinking about. That's my take on it as my your curator partner.
I can already see how this dynamic probably works while you're like applying your curatorial narrative to it, and you're like, yeah,
She's
that
great
is
at
kind of-
selling me.
I mean, this is great.
Much better than I am, but I'm trying to take off on all that you just said.
Well, do you agree with what I'm saying?
No, I do. Well, as a hot topic, the identity politics and all that's happening, I find myself struggling with actually tackling some of the stuff because of who I am and perceived to be, which is white, cis, middle class, male. It's just so not a lot of people want to hear what I have to say in a very general sense. So it's these are the times, and so part of me wants to be less political.
That's interesting.
Okay.
I feel like maybe it's because I had my therapy session earlier this week, but I'm tempted to be like, so how do you feel about that in society today? Like, because I think that is an interesting observation of awareness of society, but also giving respect to everyone's voice. And so
there are topics I would like to cover that I don't feel like it's my place. So it's just sit on my hands a little and look in another direction, I guess. But
yeah, do you find yourself then like making, of course, work that explores just different concepts that you feel maybe more, I don't want to say more accepted by people, but where you feel like you can be more vocal with your points of view and opinions in some fields other than others?
Yeah, but I'm trying to think of a current example. Some of the work that's in my studio now has all these sort of collage-looking dissected parts, body parts, and sort of thing, and that's comes from this sort of notion of feeling like everything's got a label now. In terms of identity politics, I am this, 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 and this. I'm right wing. I am pro-life. I'm pro-choice. I am left wing. I am a person of color. I'm not a person of color. I'm LGBTQ. I'm not. All the. And so it's just like this sort of strange need to me, and part of me feels like it becomes more divisive in a way for everyone to have sort of this, all the things that make them, so this sort of notion of inclusivity,
it
while
calls for
positive,
categorization.
yeah,
In a way.
so that's kind of what I'm struggling with right now, is how to articulate that doesn't sound like I don't appreciate the inclusion part of people who did feel excluded.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's more, you have to more clearly articulate what those boundaries are when some of the strengths are in the gray areas. And where we're all, juggling multiple identities on any given hour or day. And some of those aren't visible. And I think that there's a lot of time and effort attached to the ones that are visible right now in this country. So, I have a certain of my identity that I don't talk about in my curatorial work that nobody really knows about, but it is part of my experience. But yeah. Does that make sense? So
that makes
I love that it's like what you're saying about your work right now. It's this almost assemblage, which we all are, these sort of Frankenstein assemblages of sort of given responsibilities and identities, ones that we self-identify, ones that we keep a little bit more to ourselves. Who among us knows all of our names? Essentially, it's just like, do you know all of my names? So few people do, and I don't know. I'm glad to hear that. It gives me a new lens to look at that newer body of work with. It's really interesting.
I love that.
Curatorial nerding.
This is fantastic, guys, because it's like, Shaun, even though I am a Puerto Rican artist, right? So like different gender than you, different ethnicity than you, different cultural background, and even main language than you do as my main language. A lot of what you're saying still resonates because I have the same thing that I have to face too. Like, does my art reflect what people think someone from my ethnicity should be painting? And I get faced with that question. Or if I make it look like what they expect, am I like okay to be the representative of my people when it comes to that? Like, there's so much that comes into it. And it's also like, how do I express my experiences and translate them into paint? And in my case, my assemblage is maybe a little more obvious because I'm using hard edge shapes, but I am putting those things together. And it's like, how to do it while knowing that there's no way we can predict what somebody else is thinking and how they're judging us. And they can never see the full picture, because even if they do get to know me, they'll never see everything. And there's parts of myself that don't come out into my artist story, nor do they come out through the art itself either. Like, in a way, sorry to use the cliche word, but we're curating the way we present ourselves online and the way we present ourselves as professional artists. So I love that you brought that up. That was gold, because that is something that I don't know. I figure, like, depending on how people take their art and what their art is about, I don't know that everybody goes that level of deep, right? In terms of what they want to portray, which there's nothing wrong if somebody just wants to make it for aesthetics. That's perfectly fine. And we all got to pay bills. So no judgment. But I like that you brought that up. And now it makes a little more sense, seeing the last, month and a half or so as my studio neighbor, seeing too how you have in fact been putting, like, at first it looked like this sounds terrible even saying it out loud, but what's the word I'm looking for, like these random pieces of body parts appearing on your canvases suddenly, and it's like, is this like a comment on massacres or something horrible like that? You know what I mean? Because it's like they're just, or at least appendages start to put together. But the way you just explain it, I'm like, okay, that makes a lot of sense. So thank you for sharing
I
that.
don't think my work is meeting what my intentions are with my artist statement. So that's sort of what I'm working on now. And I think the smaller work is more not bridging that gap, but helping me get to where I need to get with because I still like the dissection part. I like that sort of idea of taxonomy, classification, and yeah.
Yeah, I like that. No, thank you for sharing that. Well, Amanda, we asked Shaun the question about obviously his style and whatnot, but we have to ask you, why African art? It's your turn.
Why not?
Shaun, why figurative? Amanda, why African?
Yeah, I think we've sort of touched on some of this where we all meander through our lives. It's maybe not a straight and narrow path. I've never been that kind of person. I sort of followed my heart in certain ways that have terrified other people, but I was, doing anthropology and then visual anthropology. And by the way, I chose to do my master's outside of this country because it's bonkers expensive here. So I went to the UK where it was £8,000 as opposed to 20 or 40 a year or something, which is like crazy.
What?
So, yeah, big tip to all you listeners. Go get your master's outside of this country. It just make sure it transfers, which it does. You just have to pay somebody $100 to like look at your coursework and they go, yeah, this is equivalent to a master's in America. Anyway, I think at first I started thinking more about Africa when I was in South Africa in 2001, just after I graduated college from UNC Chapel Hill. And again, it was anthropology with a focus in archaeology. So I went to get my field school in archaeology and I went to South Africa. So I got training and I got back and I was doing field digs and survey work and what we call CRM work in the United States and hit a wall with that. And that's why I went and got my master's. And I started working with African sort of cultural production again through the RAI. So again, British Museum, Royal Anthropological Institute. I was looking at the photos of Emile Torde, who is somebody that was very much stylizing African bodies in an Orientalist way. And that was, obviously that's gross, but that was the way a lot of Europeans looked at, especially North Africans. And so I was looking, that was the first time I'd really heard about him and seen what this particular colonizer had been doing in terms of the way that we thought about who Africans were or could be. And that's such a broad term, Africans as well. Like, let's not even unpack that right now. So I guess, and then I came back and I just knew I wanted to work in museums. So I was working in an anthropology museum. So I was working with a collection of 1930s Tibetan photographs. I was working with work of an Indian photographer. I was working with ceramics from Asia. I was doing a little bit of everything. Mm-hmm. And little by little, I got more and more focused on African stuff because I was working with a collection of Nigerian art, mostly Yoruba production. And that landed me the job at Yale. And that's when I really started working with a particular collection and getting to know the field. And I'm interested in everything. Why not just sort of focus on this a little bit? And then I started to realize that Americans especially receive very little knowledge, transmission of African experience or art or history or anything, let alone African American art, history, experience through our schooling. And so I guess I've made it my personal focus, trajectory, effort in my work to make sure that history is visible in our day-to-day lives as Americans, because Africa is everywhere. Africa is us. And we need to learn that more. I mean, if you think about even just your cell phone, the coltan in the cell phone comes from the Congo. All the raw materials for the batteries of cars now are coming from, or at least electric cars coming from Africa. Highest number of young people in the world. Like, why aren't we paying more attention to Africa? And not to mention some of the best artists in the world. So anyway, I make that kind of a personal mission to make sure that those artists and art and histories are more prevalent in American mindsets and views. So I guess it just happened to me. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
No. That's fair. Do you get pushback though? I mean, we are in the South after all.
I have had nothing but support from the community here since I arrived back in North Carolina 4.5 years ago. And especially any Africans I've worked with, African artists are just thrilled. I think everyone I've ever worked with on the continent has just been, we're all in it together. And I'd say that's not the American way in terms of thinking about race boundaries. And it's very different. Very different. But I would say here in North Carolina, I've gotten a lot of support for the most part. Yeah. There have been some barriers, but.
Yeah. I feel like there's been a lot of changes too in at least since I got here. I got here in 2007, and I definitely got a lot more of the "you ain't from around here" kind of question in some rural areas, and I'm like, yeah, I know, I'm not, but let's move
I
on.
mean, I grew up with that, but in a different sense. Like I grew up more punk rock, and I've definitely had people say, I seen your kind on MTV.
Because you're not country.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think
And I
that's
grew up on a military base, so that also carried its own kind of identity politics and expectations, especially as a young woman. So
Yeah. And I think
Yeah.
that's so interesting of a conversation. I mean, even as you were saying, like being from North Carolina, but still might not fit the mold of what people think you should be or what society wants you to be. It's just that larger conversation of identity and perception of identity and belonging within a space or having a voice in a space. Where is it needed and where is it important to make sure that it's heard? Using whichever platform, using your art, using your work as a curator, using social conversations to put community over competition, which is a big theme that we have on our podcast too,
Mhm.
especially as
yeah.
artists, making sure come together rather than separate apart.
Yeah. And I like the
I'm-
idea too that, like, regardless of the labels, kind of like the ones you were mentioning earlier, Shaun, those like, are you straight? Are you LGBTQ? Are you white? Are you something else? Like, it's like regardless, you can still be an ally. No matter what your skin color is, you can still be an ally for other groups as long as you're not trying to dictate their stories because that's their story to tell, but you can still be an ally and represent and kind of talk about it and kind of broaden the conversation a little bit. So I love that you guys are mentioning that. You guys are like you're both like working in areas that somebody else might be like, some artists might be like, that's too deep, too strong, perhaps confrontational, or somebody's gonna ask me difficult questions. I'm just gonna make a pretty landscape, and that's the end of that. So I like that you guys are diving into something a little bit. You're diving into things that um are fostering conversations that people may not necessarily think about at first. So it's
Mhm.
bringing some of that up. But um, taking a quick look at your very extensive CVs, one of the things that immediately pops to mind or at least strikes is that there's a lot of travel involved with you guys. Like you've been to a lot of different cities, countries, like all over the place, which is amazing. So I'll ask you first, Amanda, what has been your favorite location to visit and curate art?
Oh man, you haven't heard enough from me yet. I will say first that traveling has been a lifelong adventure already. I mean, I've been doing it since I was 15 or 16. I really got a passport at a pretty early age on my own and saved all my money. And to me, getting out of your comfort zone is so important to pluralize your perspectives and just really understand other people. It only helps us all to be healthier together and more supportive. So I'm so dedicated to that kind of intentional travel. I don't just go and stay in a resort. I'm not that kind of person. So I'll just preface all of that. I'd say I love traveling alone. I love meeting people, and I really loved going to Venice the last few times I've been for the Biennale. It definitely opens my mind and makes me think about different kinds of artists, learn artists I might not have come across. There's a great installation of Sami people. There was just like a lot of really interesting narratives coming through in this, but I also really adore traveling with him because he'll be into going to see all the exhibits and the art with me as well. So it's good to have like a partner in art crime. So we'll go see all those things. I will say I also really have loved Iceland. Like when I was there, I'm looking forward to getting back there someday, sometime. Those are the first two that came up.
Place to curate.
Place to curate?
Travel. Yes.
Well, I mean, I think of that as curating going to Venice, which is why I mentioned it, because I wouldn't learn about those artists or connect with them or see the way that they're working in different themes if I didn't kind of see it in that context. I really loved curating at Yale. I do miss being there. And I think for the simple fact that they had the support and the financials to do really interesting work. And
that goes a long way.
It's not often the case with museums. We're often struggling financially to, you know, get those budgets up to what we want them to be. The dreams are a lot bigger than the budgets, essentially. So yeah, it was a great place to curate. All my dreams were reachable there. It was really great. And I think that's probably enough from me. So
yeah, that's awesome. Well, you even touched on it, and we mentioned earlier, obviously you guys are a married couple. And so Shaun, before you answer where your favorite place to travel is, I am curious, how did you guys first meet? We've talked a lot about your history, your foundation of art and where you are now, but how did your guys paths cross?
You're answering this one.
Yep.
Stop falling into you.
The epic love story. Give it to us.
It's a very common story. I was working at a bar a few nights a week, and she came in.
And the rest is history.
So
Oh no, we need more details. Not too much detail, but a little more.
In Smalley, as she was saying, in Raleigh, CUNY's not that big, and the place I worked at had its share of regulars, and she was someone that none of us had run into, and you were very friendly.
I just moved in from California, basically moved back.
Yeah, this was 2018, probably.
Awesome.
And
we're still new.
She was, I'm trying to think, we'd had a couple of conversations through mutual acquaintances, and then you came in with a big folder and a book, and
it's my MO.
Yeah, and
I read in bars.
Yeah.
Isn't it the best? That's my favorite thing to do. Just like go pour me a whiskey drink. I'm going to sit here and read a book. Don't talk to me.
Oh my
And
God.
even a bartender can talk.
Yeah, it's often the only time I get to really do the reading, the articles. So I'm usually reading for work. It's not often a novel. It's a rare treat to read a novel when right now I'm reading one, so it's great.
So you had a big art book, and Shaun's like, wait, hold up. Art, let's discuss.
I think you had folders, and I don't think you were reading. I think you were making notes on stuff. But anyway, asked her what she was working on, and she said, and I was like, oh, I know art, and I'm in the arts, and blah, blah, blah.
I know art.
No art.
Asked more questions without being too like, you're obviously there to do that alone. Like, it's not like you're there to monopolize your time. I'm working, there are other people around, but it was a slow night. And we just had a lot of things in common in terms of like the artists I knew and liked a lot, like Ngechi Mutu and who was the Miguel Ngozi.
Malika Ngozi, yeah. It's not a fake.
Anyway, so, and I was like, oh, do you know him? She's like, of course I love him. Of course I love him. You know, those sorts of.
That is awesome.
And then when we got to talking about where she was working, I was like, oh, do you know, blah, blah, blah. And she was like, he hired me.
You're like, wow, we have all the same friends. We should hang out. The rest is history.
So maybe within a few weeks, she was there on a night that was slow, and I got cut. And so I got a drink and sat down beside her, and we closed the bar, I think. And I asked her out halfway through that period, and she was like, I have a boyfriend. And I was like, okay, whatever.
I still had a bad decision back in California. So I had to cut loose.
That's one of those, you know?
Perfect.
So this was like maybe November, and then she broke off with him in maybe January. I remember exactly.
I saw the writing on the wall.
And then together.
You're like, so this guy.
Yeah, January. We got together pretty quickly, and then we moved in together March, April of 2019. So we knew, when you know, especially at our age, you know, we've been through enough relationships and failures. You're like,
but we weren't scared.
Well, my little story is that I kept seeing these amazing paintings. It's the Person Street Bar, PSB. So Shaun used to have a lot more paintings in there, and I just kept commenting on them to the bartenders who I was becoming friendly with. I was like, ooh, these paintings are amazing. I'm like, who does this work? It's so good. And they're like, don't you realize that guy works here? It's that guy. Like, they pointed him out, and I think I saw him for the first time then. I'd seen him, but I hadn't like noticed him. And put him on my mind map in a different way, and my heart map as well. I was like, oh. So yeah, and then that night that we shut down the bar, it was pretty big deal. It's like, I like you,
Not available,
but not available. That's a
Let's be
temporary.
friends.
That's a
Yeah, you're like,
temporary.
I can fix that. It's fine. But good for everyone to be respectful of boundaries. And like you said, when you know, I feel like that's a wonderful Raleigh perfect art story. Book at the bar and all. But since then, still being relatively new, I mean, you're several years into it now. Where's your guys' favorite been to travel together? And Shaun, where's your favorite place traveling independently, just to either create art or view art?
Where have we been together that was your favorite?
I don't know. That's hard in some ways because so I really enjoyed Germany, but it was also really hard because we were in Germany from fall of 2020 through fall of 2021, and that was pandemic and everything was closed. So we got to a place and we couldn't do anything basically, and then we couldn't leave the city as they got stricter and stricter with mandates. You couldn't go more than 7 kilometers or something at one point. And I found walking my dog and just seeing the city. We were in Hamburg. It's the second largest city in Germany. It's full on big city transportation system, subway, easy trains to other cities and other countries. We couldn't do any of that. We just had to stay.
It was hard.
So the street art, the architecture, just all the signage you don't quite understand what you're reading, and as trying to learn another language, I really enjoyed. I found that very inspiring. It doesn't reflect my work, I would say, but I had a hard time making art in Germany because I had a hard time getting art supplies and finding a suitable place to work.
And I remember
two key elements.
Yeah, we couldn't find any studios in Hamburg, and anything that was even bordering on it was just way out of our price range. He ended up doing a sort of short residency in Berlin. So we were kind of living separately for a little bit. We saw each other on the weekends, but it was temporary.
But I mean, other travel we've done, at that same time when things did open up, which was that following summer, June, July, August, we went to Croatia, and that was really awesome. Unexpectedly awesome. Like,
yeah, I've always heard that's one of the underrated gems in Europe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go to Croatia. Dubrovnik and Split. And then we did we got a car. I really splurged. I wouldn't normally do this. I'm kind of like a hyper, I don't know.
She will fly for 30 hours to go someplace you get there in 12 if it's cheap.
Like, what can I afford? Yeah, I'll sleep on couches. I don't care. So, but I sort of booked us this little transfer from Dubrovnik back to Split through Bosnia. And neither one of us had ever intended to go to Bosnia or knew what was in store. So we did a little bit of research and reading. We went to Mostar, and that was one of the most amazing places I've ever been. We saw, this amazing wall. I forget what the name of that place was, but Split is really amazing. And then we didn't realize it, but lots of Game of Thrones is filmed there too. And we both like Game of Thrones. So we only did nerdy Game of Thrones tours to some of the historic places.
Sounds incredible.
And I did that in Malta. I got to see Littlefinger's brother. That was cool.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, Malta. That's all nice.
I love that. Yeah, if you guys haven't been, that's an awesome one. Also underrated. It's one of those like Europeans know about it, Americans don't. But now you do. And anybody listening, it's a really cool spot.
Yeah, I almost booked my flight last night to Malta. Not even kidding.
Wait, are you serious?
Yeah. So after Kigali, I want to go because I'm doing some travel over the next couple of months. A lot of it's for work and research and art fairs, but then I wanted to take 2 weeks off and go learn to scuba dive. I always wanted to do. And he kind of threw Malta in my radar. He was like, dude, Malta. I've been hearing some things. And I was researching last night. I was like, ooh, Malta.
We'll have to talk. Yes.
Yeah. And it's affordable. I was just trying to figure out which part of the island I want to stay in. There's also, was it Gozo, the next other bigger island? So anyway, I'm thinking I can get a scuba certification for $400 or $500. I was like, I'm going to do that. So it's amazing. Trying to live my best life right now.
Yeah. We can talk more offline on this, but my husband is a scuba instructor and some of his training was in Malta. But anyway,
Recommendations.
Yeah.
Okay.
yes. And when I went there, I was like, yeah, let's do all the ocean stuff. So yeah, but it's an art podcast, so
Yeah.
bring it back, guys. Bring it back. I know. I'm like, I feel like
spin-off.
we could talk about travel. I don't know, for hours. Like,
The whole
Yeah.
episode.
But with all
Like-
that traveling, I am curious because even Shaun, you mentioned doing like art residencies while you're traveling. And of course, now having a studio at Art Space. I'm personally an artist that's very like affected by my creative space, and I need to kind of like expand and grow into the space, get settled. And so I'm curious with your creative process, how does like switching locations affect your work, or does that affect like how long it takes before you feel settled to then make work? Or are you an artist that can make work while on the fly while traveling more nomad style?
I mean, not on the fly. I like working big, but the thing I got to once I could get art supplies in Germany was how would I get things back? And so I was already painting on Mylar a bit. It's easy to roll up. And so that's what I ended up doing was getting a roll of like 40-inch wide, 50-inch wide by 100 feet of Mylar. And it cost me $70 to ship like 10 paintings back. But
That's awesome. That's a great trick. Because I feel like a lot of the time when people think large scale, I think of large stretch canvases or something that's even if it's on a hardboard, you still have this huge box. So that's a great trick of just a roll of Mylar, roll it up.
But I mean, there is that environment affecting like what you're making and all that. But I'm gonna think of how to preface this. I have stories about other residencies and things I've done. For me, it's like no matter where you go, there you are. I mean, like, so where I'm at doesn't necessarily affect how things work already. I did a residency on Bald Head Island through No Boundaries. I don't know if you guys have heard of that one.
Yeah.
And they set you up in this beach house, but beach house sounds extreme. It's a cottage, but they're the former lighthouse keepers' cottages. So they're small, like think more like North Maine coast or like not giant 3-story,
Not the stilt castles that we see in Eastern North Carolina.
So you're given a bedroom to work in, and I found that really hard because so much of my process is built. Most of the artists were like could go out and paint the seascape, or they were maybe making naive drawings, everything out of their head, just kind of more frenetic art making and crafting things and collecting things off the beach and incorporating them. And I'm a lot more analytical. So I found that hard because I'm sort of in this place where nothing's quite set up, and I bring some my materials with me, but it's still, you don't want to discount being there and that affecting what you're doing. But I just found myself the first 3 days just like, I don't know what to do here. It's like,
yeah, because you almost want the whole purpose of being in a new space is that maybe your work or your voice shifts a little bit in reaction to it. But yeah, you don't want to completely be disconnected from work you've made in the past. So I'm sure that is a hard thing to juggle. Like how much do you let it influence you or make a commentary on the space you're in versus just, there's something also beautiful and nice about just dedicating that time to your craft and having a new space. And it might not be direct representation in the work itself. You're not doing seascapes per se, but even if it's just one color that comes in or something that influences it.
Well, he has an upcoming residency as well. I'm not sure if that was something that was on your radar, but yeah, I mean, it's about a month long. And I will just say, having watched you over the last few years, he doesn't like his momentum disrupted, and he's really great when he's like going like that every day, really good momentum. The ideas are flowing. He's making a lot of great art. And then to disrupt that can be sort of disruptive to like stop that train. So he doesn't particularly like it, but then he moves and inhabits a space very quickly. So, I mean, as you saw in Art Space, he moved in pretty quickly and already has a ton of work and a bunch of new things and new incorporations into the paintings he was already working on. So he's impressive in that sense, but also dislikes the disruption of momentum. So that's my living with you and being married to you observation.
Things like moving into Art Space, even though it's temporary, I'm there to the end of December. I don't see that as the same. Like, I intentionally just brought like work in progress.
Mm.
Well, there's a couple of things I brought, but they were on the small side. But
Mhm.
the point being, it's a working studio and to continue working on the studio. I don't want to like bring all these things in and then have to move them back out.
Right.
So
It's not a gallery space per se. It's meant to be that working studio, pieces on the floor, things taped up,
yeah,
half done pieces, things that are 5% done that might not turn into anything. And I feel like that's of course, as a fellow artist, that's the fun part of being able to have a public facing studio. It's like truly a studio. Yes, maybe take some pieces off the floor when people come in, or at least push them to one side. But other than that, people want to see that behind the scenes. How does your mind work? What pieces are you working with? Rather than just, oh, here's 12 paintings perfectly framed, hanging, and nothing else. You can go
it
to
usually
museums and galleries for that.
looks more like a beautiful mind space, like that with all the stuff taped up and lines going between things and things. Um, so I haven't gotten that deep into it, but I was working my basement for our basement, and it's a much smaller, darker space, and
It's a sadder space.
sadder space. No windows, no light.
Oh wow, so it's very different. You have like
It's perfect for
skylight,
emos.
floor to
It's
ceilings,
perfect for emos.
windows.
but I work on the other side, so it doesn't even affect like. But I forget where I was going with that. What my problem working in the basement is I run out of surfaces.
Yes.
To like make something, set it aside, start something else. And so then you have no walls quickly. And so I would be sort of relegated to one thing on an easel and one thing on one wall that I had free. And then everything else was sort of stored furniture behind me and around me. And so I found that that's like the limiting part, is not being able to like become immersive.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of the momentum thing. Um, and so not getting consistent time, and yeah, I think it really affected me being in the basement.
Yeah,
So,
he definitely was telling me he noticed a difference and how he didn't realize how depressed he was. Not depressed, it's like a strong word, but still like it's sort of a low
sad
level
compromise.
Yeah.
would have been.
compromised space and experience. Now you're
I'm
feeling the difference. But
moved out of Anchor Light. I was in Anchor Light for a couple of years before Germany, and then gave that up. Then I came back, and there wasn't really any studio space available anywhere. So sort of just
and I felt bad, to be
was
honest, because I moved
the
him to
only
Germany and like made him give up his, not made him, but he gave up his Anchor Light space. And then, you don't think about, well, will it be hard in a year or two when we get back to get space? Because there's plenty of space here, right?
Right.
there's only like 2 and 3 in town. Art
Yeah,
space,
there's
and
not
Yeah.
that much
Bonded Llama.
business opportunities, just saying. I think though, if to like piggyback on your questions for him, if you don't mind,
Yes.
I'm curious what your process is going to be like when you get to Gentel. So he's got that month-long residency, and given that it's in Wyoming and he's flying, so like, yeah, what are you going to do?
I'm going to ship a box of art supplies and
Yes.
bring a roll of Mylar, and I'm just going to tape some things out, get to work. There's no like, yeah, I don't think it's going to, wherever I'm at when I go there is what I'll be doing when I get there. Like it won't be some big departure. You know what I'm saying?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So I'm definitely going to use like the setting there to like bring into my work in terms of a lot of the reference photos I use, figure set into landscapes, or the signifiers and other things were all photos I've taken. And some things are just appropriated found images, but a lot of the background things are all. So I expect that to come into the work, but that's really the only change I see, is just wherever I'm at when I leave is what I'll be working on when I get there. And
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's like it's not like you're there long enough. I feel that way too if I'm doing a vacation, especially overseas, where I can't take that much with me anyways for a shorter vacation. So it's like you kind of continue the work you were already doing to minimize disruption in a sense, especially if you were already in the middle of a series. So some of it may come out a little bit later or may seep in, but for the most part, it's almost seamless. And then that way, when you get back, you just hit the ground running and you just keep going. It's not like, how do I feel about this experience I just had? So I really love that. But with all this travel, all these crazy schedules that I'm sure you guys have. I know that art careers, how do we put this? This is the reason our parental units sometimes have concerns about our career choices. Art careers can be notorious for their income fluctuations. So, what do you guys have other? I think you guys have kind of mentioned a little thing here and there. Do you have other gigs or income streams that you use to try to level things out a little bit when either you're in between residencies or in between other jobs or sales of art or
Gamble.
Oh,
Yeah, just marry your curator. You get that salary. Good.
yeah. Let's be clear. I work for the state.
Yeah.
I don't make a lot of money. So I teach at the university level. So often I'm visiting faculty at UNC. And I give guest lectures here and there throughout the year. And that's mostly a labor of love, but it does help. I get, I'll be clear, it's anywhere between $200 and $500 a lecture, just depending on the place and the time and the content and whatever. So that's mine. Mine's quick. I do that to help for the lean times, because sometimes, you go, it's in and out.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I'm mostly been art handling for the last year. Part-time, but it doesn't feel that part-time because it's 30 hours a week. And then at times I do it at other places at the same time. So it varies. And that's part of the momentum issue. Like I would get like work Monday through Thursday and then have Friday, Saturday, Sunday to get in the basement. And then often there's house issues or family commitments or
Mhm.
you want to do something with me because we haven't done anything all week together.
Well,
So
I want
it
some shot
becomes
time.
difficult to maintain that momentum doing it at that pace. And before the pandemic, I was working 2 nights a week at a bar. And so I had like pretty much Monday through Friday in my studio. And then Saturday and Sunday I would be, keeping that schedule. But
That was hard too, though. He's a real good sleeper. So he doesn't like.
I'm also a morning person. So
He's a morning person that
I
I'm
would have
not.
to-
Wow, my man. I always say that like sleeping is my superpower. Like nothing makes me happier than like a good 20-minute power nap. And I'm like, great, I'm
Can't
ready
do
to
it.
go.
No.
It's the best. Like if it's 5 minutes to make me fall asleep, that's like it's a tough day. I'm like,
Well,
But
he
I-
has a hard time with if he was doing the schedules at the bar. It was great because it left him so much more time for the art, right? I would in some ways prefer it to his schedule at the NCMA because he has far little time and energy for his own art.
yeah,
It also took him a good day and a half to recover from a shift.
Mhm.
Where
right.
he's
Especially
very
being
productive.
later hours. If you find creative energy in the morning when your sleep is fluctuating, that's not ideal.
it would be 7 or 8 to 4 a.m. like those 2 days.
That's rough.
So, and normally, well, without an alarm, I'll get up now at like 6 or 7. So
Yep.
it's just like my natural circadian rhythm is to just.
Yeah, so I'm sure it probably took you until like Wednesday to actually recover sleep wise. And then you'd have to kind of do it all over again.
But I mean, in the past, I've had stretches of 5 years, 7 years, 8 years where I was doing art full time.
Mhm.
The last time I stopped doing it full time, which happened about 2017 or 18, was got out of a long term relationship and all my bills doubled. And it was just one of those like, I
Mhm.
maintained it for about 6 months, and then it's like I have to give up my studio. I can't like,
Mhm.
Yeah. And I think I appreciate you guys being so transparent with that and open. I think that's also another kind of dialogue, especially for emerging artists or even established artists that isn't always talked about of, oh, well, I know it can be a self-limiting belief, especially in the beginning of your creative career of like, oh, well, I'm not a real artist until I'm doing this full time. But the more artists we know and talk to, it's like those ebbs and flows of other side gigs or income streams or phases in and out of, oh, I'm full time for a few months, or then I pick up this side job. That's kind of part of the fun creative dance in the art world of residencies for a few months, or let me just do this for 6 months in the winter because I'm just working on this collection, not really doing much traveling or exhibitions. I'm going to work on my collection and then do this side job. So I appreciate you guys being transparent about that too, because I think that'll definitely help give some perspective to all of our listeners out there. It's not, oh, well, now I quote unquote made it and now I'm just set for the rest of my life and never have to worry about anything ever again.
If you're independently wealthy, maybe, but
Yeah.
it reminds me, it's parallel to sort of musicians, right? If you're in a band or something, you might be on tour for a few months and you have to have a flexible job. So when you come back, you connect back to your catering job or your coffee shop job or whatever that's allowed on for 2 or 3 months. Because that, just like an art career, is not necessarily going to sustain you in a really even way the entire year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but also being understanding, as you mentioned, even when balancing work at maybe the art museum all day and then making your own creative work, that if you have the quote unquote stable career as your day job or alternative income stream, and then also balancing your creative practice, that has its pros and cons too. Of course, it's a more consistent, stable schedule, but it may lend less time or leave you with less energy to do your creative practice either early in the morning or in the evening when you get home. So there's definitely pros and cons to both options. And it's kind of just feeling it out what's best for you in whatever season of life that you're in at that point.
Yeah. And I like too that, Shaun, like what you're doing now is art related anyways. So I think that's probably a little more helpful, because it's like you might be doing installations. Well, now you know all the hanging systems and what actually works best. And then you can incorporate that some into your work. Or if you wanted to work with an art consultant and they need an art installer or a museum or a gallery, like it's transferable while still being in the same general area, as opposed to bartending. Well, I don't know. Maybe it helps with talking with customers, right?
I think I was doing better at making art when I was bartending than I have been since working at the NCMA. But
Are you getting
I'm trying to figure out how to
inspiration
quit
from the customers?
Yeah.
Oh, no,
And I mean, and you meet beautiful curators while you're there. So that helps too.
I'm trying to think how to, like, I was dealing with this thing where this week, I did this once last week too, where I just walked around the collection at work and was trying to find like things that got me excited or inspired me in some way. And I was just like, nope. And
Perhaps it's because it's work.
like, I was even opening the racks in storage and like looking at things that, not everyone gets to see. And I was just feeling like, I feel something and I don't feel anything. So maybe I need to back out and I also know how the sausage is made now more than I did before. And the I mean, it's not politics, but it's choices that are made are driven by so many things that often aren't about the art, and choices of either purchasing or what's shown or so it's not like unromantic. I still like think of it as like a special place, but the
bureaucracy and the politics and the administrative kind of negotiations that are constant reality of lives of museum practitioners is not something that people are often privy to. And he's starting to see that more and more. And he's just like, dear Lord. It's not dissimilar. I've been in a lot of different museums. It's just the way of it,
So I think I'd be a lot happier if I wasn't working there.
Okay.
I'm trying to figure that out now. And but like anyone in our position, being also artists, it just takes like, I don't know, 4 sales or something, like, or a couple of steps to fail, and then you can see sort of a road towards, not having to rely on. And then I've done it enough freelance where I feel like I could. We haven't had this conversation.
Have it.
Do what I used to do, which was just sort of string some things together when I needed it.
I was actually going to say, I know other artists that will kind of have a side hustle of art handling and packing and hanging things for private collections and sometimes smaller museums.
That's what I meant by freelance.
And I actually was going to mention that as like a possible scenario for him or for other artists. Like there's always a need for that. Museums aren't the only ones that buy art and hang art and need it stretched and need it packed and sent to another place, et cetera, et cetera. And having a professional coming in for your valuable art is really necessary. And you don't necessarily want to pay the crazy prices for some of these big companies, but somebody that does have a professional knowledge just one person can do it, it's far more feasible for that private individual. So it's a good model to consider.
Definitely. And especially now having, experience at a formal museum for someone who maybe in whatever range of their art collecting is, that of course gives you credibility to your expertise and like, oh, well, if he packages and hangs art at the North Carolina Art Museum, he can probably do it in my living room or in my private collection
too. Yeah. And he's done it at CAM, he's done it elsewhere. It's just like he knows what he's doing.
Yeah. Which with all this being said, of course, there are so many factors in your guys' world of how art is ingrained in it, both professionally, personally, when you travel. And so I'm curious, how do each of you define success of being an artist or being a successful art curator?
You go first.
Oh, I go first.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, that's a good one. Dang, I tried to softball it to him. I mean, there's measurable things like exhibitions and books, and I'm a goal-oriented person and I'm a very ambitious person. I don't know if you figured that out. And my goals are often, I want people to feel seen and heard, and I want to maximize the visibility of these artists that are often underrepresented. Like that's something that I find personally enjoyable and rewarding. At the same time, success is like, yeah, I got that book out. I did a Smithsonian exhibit. I was on NPR. That to me was like success. So in some ways, like I feel what I do from the very smallest things of running into an amazing person in the galleries and just having this great conversation and saying, yeah, let's do this podcast, to publishing a book with the Smithsonian and getting an NEH grant. Like those to me are both signifiers of success for the work and the goals that I have for myself and for what I see for the field. I think also success for me would be, in a longer sense, seeing the global circulations of African art be much more equitable and intentional, and capacity building being a thing that museums everywhere are working towards, for again, that global sort of sharing of knowledge and art. So that I'm working on that and in other ways in my career and in my path as well. But we'll see. I feel successful already.
I love that.
Shaun?
When I thought about my career and what I want my career to look like, it had much more to do with time to make art than it did with selling art. And there is, I'm trying to think of how to get into this. There's so many ways to make it as an artist. There's so many like avenues, ways of selling things, ways of getting your work out there through social media. You could be a portrait painter. You could be a craftsperson. You could sew. There are just all these sorts of ways that you could sort of make it happen. In the bigger, wider, more snooty art world, how you do that really matters. And so I think I'd focused more on that as a perception in a way where I'm not chasing sales. I'm not doing like overly, she criticized me for this, like not being better at social media, not being better at promoting myself. But for me, I want the energy to go into the work and not become this other, it is a whole nother job, like in art. So making it and then promoting it are two different.
Yeah, the business acumen is not something that's a strong point of a lot of artists. So that's why people like me and curators come in, but there's a huge gap between what the curator's doing and who we know about and who is on the ground making amazing work that we just may never come across. So I don't know.
Right. It's about sharing those voices, but it is kind of that you need to find that middle ground of having curators that can highlight the voices and share the story. But it is a whole other job as artists to not just have these ideas, have these concepts that you're exploring your work and making the work, but then also making sure you say enough somewhere online so that a curator can find you, or enough to where it sparks that interest of a collector. But it's definitely a fine dance in two different parts of the brain for sure.
Yeah. And this is part of the reason we do the podcast as well, is try to pick up where the art degree leaves off, if you will. like in my case, I didn't do art school, I did business school, and I am so darn glad I did because I
Yeah.
mean, art you can learn on your own. Business, well, you may lack the motivation to want to learn it. Like if I had done art first, I probably wouldn't have gone to business school. I just want to make.
So success, though, I mean, just going back there to, I feel like it's such a personal thing, and I don't feel as successful as I felt maybe 5 years ago when I was doing it more full time, and that was sort of my sole source of income and focus. And it's so much easier for me to uh, do those things hand in hand, to want to do the promotion and to want to try to foster more followers or even apply to more applications. And the whole application residencies, grants, jury opportunities is like a third job. Like it is really like you could be as busy as you wanted as an artist, like in terms of all the things that are put out there. And so developing some knowledge of what your thresholds are in terms of what you're capable of producing, to knowing what you're capable of if you're traveling, like how many times you can do that. And then the prestigious things are like, I've gotten one really prestigious thing, which was the Bemis Center. And that was back in 2010, I want to say. And nothing like that since. And I've had total imposter syndrome when I was there. I just didn't feel like I belonged. But, well, I mean, you know how it is. This is Stanford, you know.
I feel like
But I do not feel like I have a career as an artist now. It's not like that anything's really changed except the time I'm able to put into it, which I feel like has changed. I feel like I'm getting better at finding that time and carving it out. I applied for maybe 10 things since July and got the one residency, you know, and that's sort of the numbers game. You apply
that's
for
still pretty good. I mean, 1 out of 10 is still pretty good.
But for me, it's I'll say sustainability.
Okay.
Career is a sustainable endeavor where it's not a I don't know, beaten out of you. Or
Hey, we can definitely relate with that. And that's also why a lot of artists will say, I'd rather work with galleries or even go the museum route and have another job and then take the pressure of sales off of the work itself. So that when I'm working in the studio, I'm not trying to think of, will this sell? Will this not sell? How can I price it? Or do I need to do another reel or another Instagram post? It's more like, no, I'm doing the thing. Yes, you can still share some of it online, but it definitely takes the pressure off. I'm on the other side of that. I'm like, that is my job. So then I'm like, dang it, I just want to make stuff. But it's that or get a part-time. So you know how that goes. So I really appreciate that, you guys for sharing that part. But one of the things as we near towards the end, one of the things that we like to ask all our guests is what is one piece of advice that you wish you had heard before you got started on your creative journey?
number of interns over the years. And the thing I've always sort of told them is like once you're out of school and you don't have the art school environment anymore, is to find yourself shows, find yourself deadlines, and give yourself that same like class assignment feeling of like you don't want to embarrass yourself, so you're going to work on it. You're going to want to celebrate it or invite all your friends and stuff, so you don't want to embarrass yourself, so you're going to work on it, you know. And it just sort of creates that you get yourself visible in a community. I mean, if it's a coffee shop or restaurant, I did lots of those when I was, my early 20s. And that's pretty much it. Just give yourself things to work towards instead of the sort of the aimless, I need to make something or,
You're really good at that.
Yeah.
I had setting like reachable goals and treating it like, a job in a sense, but in a positive sense. For me, I think there's part of me that's like, follow your bliss. Don't be afraid to take a different meandering path, like the little hippie side of me. But then I'm also a complete workaholic type A person. So for me, it's about balance and making sure that not only am I doing all the administrative tasks and the writing and the curating and the interviewing and things that I do, but making sure I have time for my own personal endeavors like sewing and reading and playing piano and hanging out with my husband and traveling, and like finding that balance is so hard. But that's, I guess, what I would say is to make sure you follow those paths with intentionality, and yeah, reachable goals. Like, where do you want to see yourself in 5 years? Sounds so cliche, but it's like, what is that measure of success and how can you get there? So yeah, I feel like I copped out a little bit, but
To follow up on the hippie comment, there's a saying that basically goes, where your focus goes, your energy goes, or vice versa. It's the same thing. And I feel like for creative careers, whether as an artist or an art related field, I think that's important as well, to do the same thing and say, where do I want to go? I can change my path, as I go along on like a prescripted type career. We have that flexibility that other careers don't, but we don't want to drift either, because we can endlessly make, especially if you have a workaholic streak. Working 80 hours is not a joke. Like that's doable, unfortunately. So, but as we wrap it up, one of the other questions we like to ask everyone is, if somebody handed you $100, what would you splurge it on or invest in? But it has to be something that brings you joy and it relates to your art or business.
You seem to have an answer. You're smiling like you have.
I mean, my first answer is always going to be, anytime I have extra money, I'm going to travel with it. Just 100%. And that also just helps me see the world in a new way. It helps me get excited, I feel balanced and whole in my body and in my being when I get out of my day-to-day or out of my city or my house. So, but $100 doesn't go far with traveling. That's why I was like, go for a good hike, get out of town in that sense, travel in your own backyard. I think I smiling at it too, because for somebody our age, I'm 43, he's 45, I own a house, like $100 is not, like, if you'd asked me 10 years ago, I've been like, ooh, $100. Now I'm just like, that's not a lot.
Right. You're like, I could buy like 2 meals on a plane with that. Yeah, and they'll probably still be over 100.
You go to Stanbury and have a nice dinner. Like,
there you go.
What about you?
I'm trying to think.
Roll of Mylar?
What I need.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Do art supplies bring you joy?
Sometimes. But yeah, I don't know if I think about like immediate like gratification, probably would be a nice dinner.
We do like it when we can go out for our date night every now and again, have a nice dinner. I do so much cooking at home. My other thing would be, like, I love video games, so I would maybe buy a new video game instead of waiting until it's 3 years old.
Oh, there you go.
You can get more.
It's all about the simple pleasures in life and treating yourself in the moment.
I'm still straining my brain. Like, what?
He's trying so hard. Look at him.
You'll probably think of something. Think of something 2 days from now. You can come to our studios and tell us. But with that, we know we've taken a lot of your time tonight. We really appreciate you talking to us. And for our listeners, how can they stay in contact with you after today's episode?
My Instagram tag is a maple leaf on the wind.
Love it. How about you, Shaun?
I am at Shaun D. Richards, spelled S-H-A-U-N. My middle name is Douglas, so that's where the D comes from. But
I call him Dr. Richards because that's what it looks like to me. Shaun Dr. Richards.
Nice. Nice.
I love it.
Well, that's like Dr. Maple.
Dr. Maples and Dr. Richards.
Love it.
Well, thank you guys so much for being on today's episode. We really appreciate you sharing your story, your experiences, and just talking to us tonight.
Thank you. Yeah, it was great.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, everyone, for listening.
Yeah, thank you so much. Notes for everything that we mentioned is going to be on the episode's note. And if you want to stay connected with Jackie or myself in between episodes, share, your favorite parts of the episode. You can follow us on social media, Madame Art, across all platforms.
And I'm at J Sanders Studio on all platforms. Or if you want to follow the podcast, we're at Level Up Artists on Instagram. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.